disease of rivalry, of schizophrenia, of spiritual Alzheimer's.
Resistant Catholics have paid with their lives.
You can't shake an old lady like the Catholic Church without provoking cries and reactions.
Someone helped him kill himself.
The attack is immediately blamed on the Russians.
The victims won't find peace until they get justice.
Sometimes forget of a state. Pope Francis has set himself the challenge of putting Vatican affairs back in order. But did he know what he was up against? Who are these invisible enemies who have been working in the shadows for decades, trying to put a stop to any desire for change? We cross a century with the rise of fascism and Nazism under the windows of the Pope's residence, with the time of suspicious disappearances, the arrival of John Paul II and his influence on the fall of communism, and then the time of business affairs and dangerous links with the mafia. For the time of scandals did not begin in the early 2000s, with the WikiLeaks revelations and the pedophilia files in several countries. Just before the arrival of Pope Francis, one man found himself confronted with the opacity of the institution. Curia, the government of the Holy See, are said to be directly involved. The Pope knew nothing about it, so he launched his own investigation in total secrecy.
He chooses honest cardinals, serious people who are not part of the Curia.
The Pope's men arrived with their report, 600 pages long. It was most damning. The press is telling the truth. Those who run the Vatican, and in particular the Pope's closest collaborators, are embroiled in an unprecedented scandal of corruption and financial embezzlement. Worse than that, Benedict XVI has discovered that all those who tried to alert him have been removed from the Vatican.
The Church is an institution, the Curia an administration. Everyone wants to be closer to the Sun. Others are scheming in their corners. Some are gaining comfort, notoriety, and so on.
The Pope is downcast. He, the man of letters, finds himself confronted with pettiness and political violence. He goes into seclusion and asks himself questions. Does he still have real power in the Vatican?
He was a pope who, by personality, was not a pope capable of command, able to decide, able to govern.
So what can be done to put an end to these excesses? Benedict XVI knows that he has very little room for maneuver in the face of a system that has been in place for decades. But he does have one power left, a power that no pope has used for 600 years, renunciation. If the Pope renounces his duties, the entire Curia will have to resign. His mind is made up, but he tells no one. Ceremony, the Pope surprises everyone.
mystery of Bishop of Rome, successor of St. Peter, entrusted to me by the cardinals on April 19, 2005, so that from February 28, 2012 at 8 p.m., the See of Rome, the See of St. Peter will be vacant, and the conclave for the election of a new Supreme Pontiff will have to be convened by those whose duty it is to do so.
I confess that at the time I didn't understand. I remember asking my neighbor to confirm that the Pope was giving up. In reality, I understood, but I couldn't believe it.
I didn't expect it at all the day he did it. I went through the decision like everyone else with great emotion.
We're in a church where everything is ritualized, in a place where we're really part of a tradition. You're part of a tradition. And now he's doing something we've never seen before. You could really feel that his collaborators were completely stunned.
For several minutes, the cardinals remained speechless until their dean spoke up.
Holiness, beloved and venerated successor of St. Peter, your moving message resounded through this hall like a thunderclap in a serene sky. We listened to it with a sense of bewilderment, almost all of us incredulous. Quasi del tutto increduli.
The Pope was frank. He said a prayer and left. And we were left all alone without a Pope.
Joseph Ratzinger's renunciation of the pontificate is surely an extraordinary event in the history of the Church. Not just of this century, but of the millennia.
That very evening, as torrential rains poured down on Rome, a bolt of lightning struck St. Peter's Basilica. The Catholic Church was going through one of the most serious crises in its history.
This is without historic precedent, at least since the Middle Ages, and it throws up many questions. Why is he doing this? We know that this is a pope who has been criticized for his handling.
At the same time, in Argentina, a man was preparing to join the Vatican. He is the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Cardinal Bergoglio. Like all cardinals under the age of 80, he is one of the cardinal electors, those who will elect the new pope.
Se prepara para decidir quién va a manejar los destinos de la Iglesia. El cónclave que va a decidir está en pleno preparativo.
The Argentine cardinal hopes that he will return to Buenos Aires soon, without any unpleasant surprises. In 2005, he was tipped to succeed John Paul II. The man who hates the Vatican and its intrigues for power had withdrawn. But that day, as he was leaving his home, an old friend reminded him of his obligations.
This woman, whom he had known for a very long time and nicknamed La Bruja, the witch, told him, "This time, you mustn't give up as you did in 2005. You must accept the pontificate."
The archbishops and cardinals in the field, those in Boston, Bonn, or deep in Africa, they couldn't take any more Vatileaks of scandal from within the Curia itself. They couldn't take it anymore.
People were wondering what was going to become of the papacy. It was almost the end of the cycle. We were saying to ourselves, there's something wrong with the Pope's kingdom.
In March 2013, the preparatory meetings for the conclave opened. The election of the new pope is about to begin. The 115 cardinal electors take it in turns to make a speech setting out their expectations of the next And so there was the idea and the will for a very important change. Confusion always reigns as the conclave approaches. But on the third day of these preparatory meetings, a speech shook the assembly. That of Cardinal Bergoglio. He said that the church needed to be less inward-looking, less navel-gazing. And it was an important speech because it caught the attention of the cardinal electors.
It was a speech that made a big impact, and inexplicably it opened a breach. He won consensus on the idea of bringing to Rome a person completely outside the affairs of the Curia.
In the corridors of the Vatican, this speech is all anyone talks about anymore. So much so that the Argentine cardinal is wondering whether he has gone too far. He may have just positioned himself in spite of himself as a candidate for the throne of St. Peter's.
The Sunday before the conclave, Bergoglio was a little worried. And when he met a Canadian priest in Piazza Navona, he told him, "I don't know what he's planning for me, my fellow cardinals." Mes confrères cardinaux.
On March 12th, the conclave begins. All the cardinal electors entered the Sistine Chapel to vote behind closed doors. Locked and keyed, conclave in Latin. Bergoglio, like all the others, takes a vow of silence.
I, Jorge Mario Cardinal Bergoglio, promise it, vow it, and swear it. God help me and his holy gospels, which I touch with his hand. Little did the Argentine cardinal know at the time that he was already one of the favorites. Des favoris.
On the second day of the conclave, in the third vote, Bergoglio received 50 votes. And during the break, it became clear that his candidacy was very strong. Even if there were opponents on the left who would say that he was ill because he was missing a lung.
The turning point came with the sixth ballot. Bergoglio obtained an absolute majority. He no longer had a choice. He, the Argentine Jesuit, has just been named Pope.
I announce a great joy. We have a Pope.
During the announcement of his appointment, before presenting himself to the faithful, Bergoglio chose to isolate himself to pray.
Cardinal Bergoglio of the Holy Roman Church, who calls himself Francis.
He almost felt a great emptiness. And the moment he went to the chapel to pray, with Cardinal Toran and Cardinal Bellini, Cardinal of Rome, he took them both by the arm, kneeling on the same prie-dieu. And then he told them that he had been filled with a great light.
The Argentine cardinal finally accepts his destiny. He is the first South American Pope in history. He takes the name Francis in homage to St. Francis of Assisi. A sign of poverty, hope, and submission to God.
Good evening, brothers and sisters.
Buonasera.
As you know, the task of the conclave was to give Rome a bishop.
Il dovere del conclave era di dare un vescovo a Roma.
It seems that my brother cardinals went almost to the ends of the earth to find him.
Di apprenderlo quasi alla fine del mondo.
Before the bishop blesses the people, I ask you to pray to the Lord to bless me the prayer of the people asking for the blessing of their bishop.
Chiedendo la benedizione per il suo vescovo.
Bonne nuit et bon repos.
The crowd cheers this new pope with his unexpected profile. But some in the Vatican do not take kindly to his arrival.
For the moment, it's a honeymoon. But the day will come when he'll have his back against the wall. One day, he'll come up against the hardcore of the Curia.
He had no intention of becoming pope, but this time he couldn't escape it. He is the new head of an ailing institution, shaken by repeated scandals. Will Pope Francis be able to breathe new life into the Catholic Church and restore its image? At least that's the challenge he set himself. But first, how did it come to this? Is the Vatican going through its first major crisis in such a visible way? Perhaps a century ago, because before that, the thick walls of St. Peter's Basilica have long been the guardians of the secrets, intrigues and betrayals that have played out there. This is the story we're about to delve into. Let's begin in 1929. Vatican City is preparing to become a state, with a territory, a government and a role to play once again in the concert of nations. But this change in status was the result of an unholy alliance with Italy's ruling fascist party, led by Benito Mussolini. That morning, a procession of official cars heads for the Lateran Palace, the former residence of the popes. A delegation from the Italian government was meeting with representatives of the Church to define the Vatican's new status. The Italian Prime Minister and leader of the fascist party, and leader of the fascist party, Benito Mussolini, nicknamed the Duce.
The Duce didn't actually have the church in his heart, but he knew he could only truly rule Italy if he put the Catholics on his side.
With the Lateran Agreement, the Church, deprived of its land since Italian unity, obtained a sovereign territory of 44 hectares, much smaller than before but still right in the heart of Rome, around St. Peter's Basilica. As compensation for the ceded territories, the Kingdom of Italy paid the Vatican an annual sum of 750 million lire.
On that day, the Church, the papacy and the Pope himself regained their status. It may seem like nothing, but it's fundamental. When you're the Catholic Church, when you claim to be universal, you need to be recognized internationally. And since that day, only the Catholic religion has had such status.
Pope Pius V was the clear winner in these negotiations. An absolute monarch, he already had all the power within the Vatican. He was now in a position to get involved on the international stage, as head of state.
Pius V was a very political pope. He was a scholar.
He was a man who wanted to preserve the Church's autonomy from Mussolini.
But this pact with the fascist regime soon turned into an arm wrestling match. In the texts, it is written that the Church is responsible for school education in Italy. But Mussolini had no intention of losing control of young people.
All totalitarian regimes have this obsession with getting young people on their side. The problem is that for the Church, it's much the same.
Mussolini quickly broke his commitments.
Rapidement ses engagements.
He closed down all Catholic youth associations in Italy and sent his fascist youth into the streets of Rome.
Dans les rues de Rome.
The Pope could only watch helplessly as the Duce took control of the country.
Undoubtedly, there was no question of opposing Mussolini head-on for good reason. Pour une bonne raison. The Pope had no means of doing so.
But Italy isn't the only country affected by the rise of extremes and identitarian withdrawal. The economic crisis of 1929 plunged Europe into social chaos.
century onwards, the Italian aspect of the problem became secondary to the German one.
That morning, the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Pacelli, came to warn the Pope of a worrying development in Germany. The new Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, was in the middle of a speech at the Berlin Sports Palace. In his speech, broadcast over the radio, he calls religious beliefs into question.
I don't want to tell our people that the resurrection will happen by itself. We want to work, but the people themselves must make the effort.
We must not believe that freedom, well-being, and life are a gift from heaven. It's all rooted in our will, our work.
Did Hitler think he was God? Does Nazism want to be a religion? So what fate does he have in store for German Catholics? The Pope decided to enter into negotiations with the National Socialists in an attempt to preserve the interests of the Church and its faithful.
Pius Levine tried to contain the rise of Nazism and above all the threat it posed to Christianity in Germany by signing a concordat that was fiercely criticized.
A concordat signed on July 20th, 1933 between Secretary of State Pacelli and German Vice Chancellor von Papen. Pacelli obtained a guarantee that the voice of the Church would always be heard in Germany through the Christian Party. But Hitler scoffed at the agreement. No religion should interfere in the politics of the Third Reich. He ordered the dissolution of the Christian Party.
This concordat with Germany was not balanced. Hitler got pretty much what he wanted, and the Vatican was unable to safeguard its political autonomy from Nazism.
Pius X wrote a handwritten text, an encyclical, to keep German Catholics on the straight and narrow. The encyclical was immediately relayed by priests in every church in Germany. When Hitler discovered this, he attacked clerics throughout the country.
Some Catholic resistance fighters paid with their lives. The parish priest of Berlin Cathedral was shot by the Nazis. The auxiliary archbishop of Munich died in the Dachau concentration camp.
In 1938, the situation in Germany worsened. On the night of November 9/10, synagogues were set on fire. Businesses ransacked, thousands of Jews arrested or murdered. By the end of Kristallnacht, over 30,000 German Jews had been deported. How did the Pope react to this persecution? His position, not to put the Catholic community at risk.
Especially as Germany was now a predominantly Catholic country. Germany was the world's leading Catholic country. C'est là specific to Hitler. There were anti-Semites all over Europe, including, of course, in France. And he famously said, "We are spiritually Semites."
Pius then openly condemned the excesses of Nazism. At the time, he was the first head of state to do so. But the text was never published. On the night of February 10, 1939, the Pope died of a heart attack without having had time to sign his final encyclical.
Tradition dictates that only texts duly signed by the Pope who has just died remain. The encyclical in question was on his desk. The Pope would probably have signed it within a few weeks, but he died too soon.
Could this encyclical have awakened consciences and changed the course of history? We'll never know. 3 weeks after Pius IX's death, a new Pope was elected. The voters chose Cardinal Pacelli, a former Secretary of State, a member of the Roman aristocracy and a fine negotiator. He was best placed to defend the Church's interests on the eve of the coming war. Pacelli took the name of Pius XIII, but this did not mean he would follow in his predecessor's footsteps. Faced with the rise of Nazism, the Vatican changed strategy, a choice that could tarnish the Church's image for decades to come. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, France and England entered the conflict. The Second World War begins. Vatican Radio, the Holy See's press organ, immediately reported the news.
Cardinal Hlond, who arrived in Rome after fleeing Poland, informed Pope Pius XIII this morning of the situation in his destroyed country. The Poles, Catholics, and Jews alike have been struck by famine since their food supplies and possessions were confiscated and sent to Germany.
This will be the last war report from Vatican Radio. Mussolini forbids the Pope to communicate on the subject. Pius XIII accepted the censorship. To avoid reprisals, he prefers to keep the Church out of the conflict.
The Holy See proclaims its neutrality. Why was this? Because the protagonists, the belligerents, are all Catholic or Christian peoples. And for a pope, it's impossible to condemn one without condemning the other. Of course, he's going to be called every name in the book. German Catholics, French Catholics, Belgian Catholics. All these peoples caught up in the tornado of war will obviously resent this pope.
And the Pope's neutrality became very embarrassing from 1942 onwards, when Hitler launched the final solution and decided to exterminate all the Jews in Europe.
There was evidence of the murder of millions of Jews.
The Pope was well aware that this could not be considered a fact of war like any other. Pius V and those around him were well aware that the extermination of the Jews was something special.
What happened was that Catholics hid Jews in convents and parishes, and that the Catholic hierarchy let it happen, didn't denounce them, which is not bad.
But the solidarity of these Catholics with Jewish communities contrasts more and more with the attitude of the Pope, who refuses to intervene in the conflict. In his Christmas speech, Pius XIII spoke only half-heartedly without ever denouncing the Nazi crimes.
Humanity owes this wish to the hundreds of thousands of people
up these denunciations sufficiently?
Did this increase persecution? Did it discourage those Christians who, for example, could help Jews escape deportation and denunciation? The question remains open.
But the Pope cannot turn a blind eye indefinitely. The Germans had occupied Rome since the Allied landings in Sicily. And in October 1943, they invaded the ghetto right under the Vatican's windows.
The Germans carried out a giant roundup of Rome's Jews. There were around 12,000 Jews in Rome. The Germans arrested several thousand. Trucks filled with these unfortunate people are parked along the Tiber, 400 meters from the Pope's apartment. Some people see this and rush to Pius X's apartment. In his apartment saying, "Holy Father, this is what's going on here." 400 meters away, they're loading the trucks.
Pius XIII sent an emissary to ask the Gestapo to stop the roundup.
He went to see the Nazi authorities and said, "Listen, the Pope is extremely upset. We've got to stop this, it's not possible." And in fact, the Germans went ahead and sent the first convoy of Roman Jews to disaster. Disaster.
The Pope didn't insist, but finally decided to act. A few days after the roundup, he opened the doors of the Vatican to the Roman Jews who had escaped from the ghetto.
The Pope instructed many religious parish priests and bishops to hide Jews in and around Rome. There are Jews hidden in Castel Gandolfo, in the Pope's summer residence.
In November 1943, he rescued more than 4,500 Jews from hiding in the Vatican. Or he asked monasteries and convents to take them in.
If the Vatican had reacted earlier, could it have saved more lives? 1259 Jews from Rome were sent to Auschwitz, but only 15 returned. A few months later, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang throughout Rome. Allied troops had just liberated the Italian capital. From his balcony, Pius XV blessed a jubilant crowd gathered for the occasion.
Our fatherly hearts have been overwhelmed on many occasions by the tears of our children. You are those children, and we pray for you.
But the ambiguity of Pius XV has left its mark. Through him, the entire Roman Church was challenged. The Italians, the head of the Vatican for centuries, are they still legitimate to defend the interests of Catholics the world over?
After the war, we entered a crisis of authority, in which the Church's word is debated. It is disputed, not only by people in general, but also by Catholics.
A few years later, it was discovered that from within the Vatican, a network had exfiltrated several Nazi war criminals, notably to South America. The Roman Church had totally missed its rendezvous with history. But despite this, the Pope remains in place. He centralized all power with the unconditional support of the Roman Curia. When he died in October 1958, many voices called for a modernization of the Church. A new Pope was elected, John III, age 72. No one expected change to come from him. And yet, right at the start of his pontificate, John XXIII launched the greatest reform the Church had ever known, a veritable Estates General. But the old guard of the Curia had no intention of letting him. On October 11, 1962, some 2,500 bishops, archbishops, and cardinals from all 5 continents were summoned to the Vatican for the first great council of the 20th century, the Second Vatican Council. Together, they were to devise a new organization for the Church and redefine its place in the modern world.
Council, as in the 19th century, is the most important assembly imaginable in the history of the Church. And now, this Pope, who was said to be in transition, is launching this unprecedented adventure.
He realized that there was a problem between the language spoken by the Church and the language of the modern world. That's why this famous update is necessary, so that the voice of the Church, the voice of the Gospel, can once again be heard clearly.
I remember the morning of October 11, 1962. I was a young priest working at the Secretariat of State and had worked in my modest way on the preparations for the council. My office overlooked St. Peter's Square, and I remember marveling at that procession, that uninterrupted litany of bishops of all kinds.
Usually you see a pope who's always been Italian for 500 years. Now we see bishops who speak all sorts of languages, and you get the feeling that now it's up to them. They're the ones with the power. The whole world is gathered here. It seems as if the moon itself has hastened here tonight to watch this spectacle that even St. Peter's Basilica, with its 4 centuries of history, has never been able to contemplate.
La Basilica di San Pietro, che ha 4 secoli di storia, non ha mai potuto contemplare.
But the Roman cardinals, nicknamed the Party of Italians, don't want this council. Ils ne veulent pas de ce concile. In power for centuries, they refuse to let themselves be dictated to by new rules, by bishops from the other side of the world. From then on, they did everything in their power to keep control of the debates.
The Roman Curious theory is that we're going to celebrate the...
A great conservative, Ottaviani has no desire for change, and he says so. He says the Church is immutable. We're not going to lower the Church to the point of dialogue with just anybody. There's no question of revolution.
He is the patron saint of the Holy Office, the Vatican body that monitors the regularity of the faith. Basically, he's the Grand Inquisitor.
Evidence, the Holy Office at its head, that is you. You don't have a good reputation, why not?
We are judged by the dates of past centuries, not on what life is like today. You know that the Holy Office succeeded the Inquisition, but it's no longer the Inquisition.
Ottaviani answers the journalist with a slight smile. But in reality, he's enraged. He hadn't anticipated this media overexposure.
And that's what the Curia, the Roman administration, Cardinal Ottaviani hadn't thought of. There was a guest at the council that no one had anticipated. Apart from the bishops and the Holy Spirit, who is supposed to be there, there was public opinion from all over the world.
Ottaviani felt the situation slipping away from him. The council was set to last. But an unexpected event could work in his favor. On the night of June 3rd, 1963, John XXIII died suddenly in his sleep. The Pope was dead. Vatican II was thus suspended. himself who was to officially announce his election. Cardinal Montini.
Cardinal Montini, just elected Pope, said his first task would be to bring the council to a successful conclusion and then to put it into practice.
Cardinal Montini takes the name Paul VI. 3 months after his election, he opened a second session of the Second Vatican Council. But Ottaviani and the more conservative cardinals were not resigned. The Pope wanted to reduce the power of the Curia to make the Church more democratic. They'll do anything to stop him.
They tried to convince Pope Paul VI to defer these questions. They got no answer. And so they're going to carry out an act that is a kind of coup d'etat that is absolutely incredible.
Ottaviani sent one of his men to the Vatican printing house to simply destroy the documents needed to adopt this reform.
He stopped the printing of the bulletins on which the questions were printed and had them burned, saying, "The Pope has not validated these questions. And since the ballots are burnt, we can't vote."
The vote is delayed, but Ottaviani's maneuver does not go unnoticed. An internal war breaks out within the Vatican between members of the Curia and supporters of reform. Leading the reformers were the German Cardinal Frings and his young assistant, a certain Joseph Ratzinger.
At the time, Joseph Ratzinger was reputed to be a progressive and liberal theologian. And indeed, he was an advocate of collegiality. It was he who wrote the speech on collegiality for Cardinal Frings against Ottaviani.
A few days later, in the middle of the council session, Cardinal Frings suddenly took the floor. Ratzinger had written his speech. It was a real charge against the Curia.
He accuses the Curia and the Holy Office of being a scandal against the gospel. The worst accusation of all.
Frings attacks Ottaviani directly. It's because of cardinals like him that the Vatican needs more democracy.
These are very violent words, and Ottaviani is going to insist on being able to respond immediately. Normally, you have to take your turn. He said to have turned as red as his dress.
But Ottaviani won't have time to respond. To avoid a confrontation, the session chairman decides to turn off the microphones.
Poor Ottaviani, who presented himself as the old carabinier who must watch over the church treasury, was humiliated. The commentators are delighted, naturally.
A scandal that exposes the divisions within the church between Italian conservatives and the rest of the Catholic world.
You can't shake an old lady, like the Catholic Church was. 2,000 years old without provoking cries and reactions.
In all, the council lasted 4 years. 4 sessions that did not fundamentally change the functioning of the church, but they did give greater autonomy to foreign bishops.
The council did not revolutionize the church, but it did change it in a more modern direction, and above all, in a direction that gave greater importance to each country. In other words, the fact that we express ourselves at Mass in the language we speak increased the autonomy, not the independence of each church and each nation. But we expected too much from this council if we imagined it would allow priests to marry. It didn't.
The church tried to make its revolution, but it was without counting on a major upheaval in society. In May 1968, the liberation of morals was to undermine all institutions, starting with the church. Vocation crisis, drop in donations. The main consequence for the Vatican was empty coffers. To manage its finances, the Catholic state has its own bank, the IOR. Until now, its main function has been to collect donations from the faithful. At the end of the 60s, Pope Paul VI decided to open it up to private investors. To this end, he sought a man he could trust to head the Vatican Bank. He made a surprising choice. In November 1970, Paul VI was on an official trip to the Philippines. No sooner had the Pope set foot on the tarmac when a man emerged from the crowd and tried to stab him. But one of the bishops in the delegation intervened and saved the pontiff's life. This American bishop, a colossus of 190 meters, is called Paul Marcinkus. That day he became the Pope's right-hand man. It was to him that Paul VI decided to entrust the reins of the Vatican Bank.
He began his career as a bodyguard. In other words, he was far removed from the management of the worldwide Catholic Church. A resourceful man, he was quite close to Paul VI. In this curia, where no one dares to get into the financial thick of things, you'd think an American would know how to do it, what a dollar is, and so on.
But in reality, Paul Marcinkus knows nothing about finance. So, as soon as he was appointed, he sought advice from leading Italian bankers. And some of them are keen to find an interest in working with the Vatican Bank. The first was a Sicilian named Michel Sindona.
Michel Sindona was a man who caused Italy a lot of financial problems. But he was protected by the Christian democracy of the time. And his bank, Banca Privata, also laundered dirty mafia money, the Causa Nostra.
So, when Marcinkus explained to him that he needed to replenish the church's coffers, Sindona offered him nothing more and nothing less. Sindona offers to help him launder mafia money. Marcinkus knowingly accepts.
What did Paul Marcinkus say? He said that you can't run a church with Hail Marys. You need money.
I once knew someone who brought cash in suitcases to the Vatican, to the bank. So these are not fantasies. These are things that really happened. At the time, the Vatican Bank accepted money from everyone. The Maliana gang, a Roman criminal gang, put a lot of money into the Vatican Bank. Because even though it's located there on a street in Rome, it's almost an offshore bank. In other words, there are no tax inspections.
Sindona introduces Marcinkus to another financial partner. And not just any financial partner. Italy's big money man, Roberto Calvi.
Roberto Calvi, who was Italy's greatest banker, #1 at Banco Ambrosiano, was in business with Sindona.
Calvi figured that the Vatican Bank's good reputation could enable him to practice tax exile on a large scale. Its clients are major Italian industrialists who want to avoid paying taxes, but also political parties who want to circulate money discreetly. All these financial arrangements are perfectly illegal. But since everyone's doing it, why not the church?
Marcinkus is very proud to associate with bankers of this level and so on, and to handle so much money. He's pretty full of himself, Marcinkus, on this one.
The Vatican Bank had an active role in this complex operation. This vast, huge operation, and it had an active role because it made money. It gained a lot. Every time money passed through the Vatican Bank, she received a commission.
Within a few years, the Vatican coffers filled up again. The money was flowing. And for the time being, the Pope has nothing to say about it.
Paul VI was a very refined pope. A pope very detached from the material activities of the church. Perhaps didn't pay enough attention to the role of the bank. So who was the Vatican Bank maneuvering for?
When churchmen want to deal with economics, they always do anything.
Because it's obvious. It's the confrontation between the supernatural world and the real world, where the rules of the game are set by those who play in the real world.
The Martinkus system remains in place with the Pope's blessing. But when Paul VI dies of a heart attack, everything was called into question, because his successor is reputed to be incorruptible.
John Paul realized that the Vatican Bank represented a huge problem for the Holy See. A problem not only of transparency, but of connections and involvement so dirty that they could have led to repeated scandals with irreparable damage to the church.
The new Pope seems determined. He wants to see the accounts to clean up the finances. He won't have the time. Just 1 month after his election, he too fell victim to a heart attack.
John Paul I remained Pope for just 33 days, and his death is still a mystery. Despite the official version of cardiac arrest, is still shrouded in mystery. Did he really die of a heart attack, or did someone provoke his death?
A suspicious death that suits Marcinkus just fine. No investigation will be opened into the death of John Paul I, nor into the Vatican's hidden finances. Once again, a pope must be elected. It remains to be seen whether he will take an interest in this dubious banking system, which has been filling the church's coffers for years with dirty money.
Cardinal Wojtyła of the Holy Roman Church.
Cardinale Wojtyła.
When the name Karol Wojtyła was mentioned, everyone thought he's an African pope. Wojtyła is an African-sounding name. It took them a while to realize that this was a pope from Poland.
He was the first non-Italian pope in 5 centuries, and indeed it was a rupture. Not only is he not Italian, he is Polish. In other words, he comes from a communist country. He comes from the other side of the Iron Curtain.
Cardinal Wojtyła is the first pope from Eastern Europe. His origins could have a positive effect on relations between the Church and Moscow.
We're in the middle of the Cold War. Eastern Europe is in Soviet hands. And for 30 years, Catholics in communist countries have been cut off from the world. With a Polish pope, at a time when everything seems to be at a standstill between the two blocs, the Church could play a major role on the international stage, as it did when it made and unmade kings.
No one would ever have thought of electing a foreigner, and certainly not a pope from Eastern Europe, from the Soviet bloc. A candidate capable of breaking down that impenetrable wall of ice that prevented the Church from speaking to Catholics under Soviet domination.
My dear brothers and sisters, we are all still saddened by the death of our beloved Pope John Paul I.
Ad onorare, dopo la morte dell'amatissimo Papa Giovanni Paolo I.
And now the eminent cardinals have called for a new Bishop of Rome.
Hanno chiamato un nuovo vescovo di Roma.
They have called him from a faraway land.
Di un paese
This Pope has a flair for communication. You can feel it from day one. He was not only an actor, but also a journalist. When he speaks to a crowd, he knows how to speak to a crowd.
At 58, Karol Wojtyła takes the name John Paul X. And the young Pope imposes a style very different from his predecessors.
The Roman Curia, so aristocratic, so tied to the old rules, was not used to dealing with such a young man.
A Curia that will soon be reassured. It regained all its power with this new Pope, who had no intention of meddling in internal affairs.
John Paul II showed very little interest in the Roman Curia. He didn't have in mind a church that would rule the world from the Vatican. He had in mind a church that would challenge the world, fight it in all its negative aspects.
John Paul II's struggle was both religious and political. He spent his entire childhood under the yoke of the communists. Now he wants to use his status as Pope and head of state to bring them down.
That was the battle every morning. I think he's been fighting ever since he was a little boy. He fought as a child. It was very painful. He lost his mother when he was very young. He lost a little sister. He was left alone with his father. He was a man who had always been used to fighting.
John Paul II used all the resources the Vatican had to offer. His diplomatic network, but also his finances. Banker Marquinhos had nothing to worry about. All the Pope wants him to do is to keep the money flowing into the church's coffers.
John Paul VI understands that Marcinkus can be a valuable instrument in his hands. Peut-être un instrument précieux entre ses mains.
Wojtyła never asked where the money in the Vatican bank came from.
D'où venait l'argent de la Banque Vatican, del denaro dello Lione.
With the entire state apparatus behind him, the Pope went to war against the Soviet Union. His strategy was simple. He relied on the power of his words and the hope they inspired to return to Poland. 1 year after his election, he achieved the unthinkable.
Il va réussir l'impensable.
On June 2nd, 1979, Karol Wojtyła returned to Warsaw.
The day the Polish Pope landed at Warsaw's Olokins Airport,
à Varsovie, sur le vieil aéroport au Kielce,
you could feel that something was about to happen. I was one of thousands of journalists following this incredible journey. A Pope behind the Iron Curtain was unheard of.
On the day of his arrival, the Pope was welcomed as a head of state by the Polish Prime Minister.
Ministre polonais.
I would like to say that all of us Poles attach particular importance to your visit. We are convinced that this visit will serve the values that are most precious to us.
Always prosperity and the good of mankind. This is where a number of people in Moscow, including Mr. Suslov, the head of ideology, Mr. Brezhnev, the general secretary, are saying that the Poles have fallen on their faces.
Moscow is well aware of the trap into which the Polish authorities have just fallen. The Pope is using his personal history to justify his return to Poland. In reality, he has simply infiltrated the Soviet bloc to destabilize it.
Pour le déstabiliser.
He knows that every word he utters can act as an explosive charge to dynamite the Soviet system from within.
De l'intérieur.
journey many Hungarians who are wondering what is happening in Poland and even beyond. There are Lithuanians in the USSR, there are Ukrainian Catholics in the USSR itself, who are saying, what is this Pope saying to us Slavs? The people of this part of the world.
And what repercussions could this trip have in the world, and in the East in particular?
On Verance, I hope the repercussions will be positive.
Repercussions that are not long in coming. A year after the Pope's visit, strikes broke out all over the country. Over 10 million Polish workers rally under the banner of Solidarność, Poland's first independent workers' union. A union launched by Les Walesa. The strike lasted for weeks, and the workers only interrupted their movement to take part in the masses organized in the middle of the street.
Then recovering in his robe. It's the first time the Pope's body has become a human body, visible and suffering like any other human.
The Pope's convalescence will last 21 days. And all this under the worried gaze of the faithful massed outside the hospital. 21 days during which the press wondered who had ordered the assassination. Who wanted to kill the Pope? Many saw it as the work of the Russian secret services.
The attack was immediately attributed to the Russians. It's easy to see how the Polish and Soviet authorities were beginning to get on each other's nerves. Vis-a-vis a Pope who, after a trip to Poland, was destabilizing Central Europe.
The shooter, Mehmet Ali Aka, a Turkish extremist militant, was arrested and interrogated. But he would never say who had sent him to kill the Pope that day. On leaving hospital, John Paul II remained convinced that the Soviets were indeed behind the assassination attempt. And as a good politician, he sought support from their greatest enemies.
Wojtyla decided without giving it much thought that any ally who could help him was a good one. Let's just say that from this point of view, he's very pragmatic and realistic, and he is a Pope who is truly unscrupulous in his approach to the Polish problem.
On June 7, 1982, U.S. President Ronald Reagan visited the Vatican.
Est en visite au Vatican.
Your Holiness, this is
I believe that after his meeting with Reagan, John Paul II began the most active phase of his action against the Soviet Union. Contre l'Union soviétique.
Behind the scenes, the Americans agreed to help John Paul II in his fight against the communists. To this end, they intended to provide financial aid to the Solidarność trade union, supported by the Pope.
It is very clear, and we now know it, that the American services, Américains, and either the CIA directly or much more often organizations linked to it, helped the Solidarność trade union.
The Pope and the Americans wanted to use the occult system of the Vatican Bank to transport this money discreetly.
Le système occulte de la Banque du Vatican.
But 2 weeks after President Reagan's visit, this system was once again under threat. On June 18, 1982, Roberto Calvi, Marcinkus' financial partner, was found hanged in the shade under a Thames bridge.
If he had committed suicide, chances are someone had helped him to do it.
The investigation into this mysterious death reveals the existence of a mafia system in which the Vatican Bank is allegedly involved. The Italian justice system is seeking to arrest Marcinkus, but as long as he remains in the Vatican, he is untouchable, and the Pope refuses to hand over his banker to the law.
We issued an arrest warrant for Marcinkus. At the time, it was absolutely impossible to cross the wall. It was absolutely impossible.
The courts were forced to drop their proceedings, and Marcinkus continued to deal in money, sheltered by the city walls.
Marcinkus remained in office and in power until the end. He was protected by Wojtyla until his death.
The Pope covered up his bankers' excesses so that he could continue to finance the Polish Revolution, a decision that paid off. In November 1989, the whole world witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. The wall that symbolically separated Eastern and Western Europe had fallen.
L'Europe de l'Ouest est tombée.
The Polish Revolution spread throughout the Soviet bloc. Communist regimes collapsed one after the other.
S'effondrent les uns après les autres.
John Paul II was one of the actors in the fall of the wall in Europe. He really deserves credit for that. Would he have succeeded if he'd been more careful, more cautious, more hesitant? I'm not sure.
During the 90s, John Paul II multiplied his travels to continue to occupy the international scene. But the world was once again at war, and his message of peace was no longer heard.
N'est plus entendu.
The 90s saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, wars in the Balkans, and wars in Africa's Tukulur region. The powerlessness of the Pope's message. He said the all. The wall has come down. The Cold War is over, and now there's war again.
During the fight against communism, the Pope had many powerful allies, and he campaigned against war. But all the allies he had before no longer agreed with him. And so his voice was one that today we might call prophetic, but which at the time nobody wanted to hear.
The last moments of his pontificate were difficult. Stricken by Parkinson's disease, the Pope was very weak and no longer able to govern. But he had such an aura that no one would dare question him.
It was a terrifying agony, even uncomfortable for many people, including those around him. He knows perfectly well the image he gives on television around the world. Deep down, this is his last message, a fundamental message. It's that, right to the end, a man is worthy, he stands up. That's how it is. It's a wonderful message, and at the same time, it marks the end of an era.
John Paul II died on the night of April 2nd, 2005, at the age of 84. 3 million faithful attended his funeral. Around 100 heads of state made the trip. During his 26-year pontificate, John Paul II left his mark on generations around the world. The modern media made him an icon.
It was as if, in the space of a ceremony, the entire planet was in remembrance. That's how many people remember him.
This great pontificate, which had touched the world as we saw at the time of his death, left a legacy that was both heavy and full of difficulties.
John Paul II made history and gave the Vatican a new diplomatic dimension. But in his desire to change the world, he completely abandoned the Church's internal affairs in favor of the Roman Curia, which had once again become all-powerful. A new pope was named, Cardinal Ratzinger, a former advocate of reform who had joined the conservative camp after the shock of May 68. He took the name Benedict XVI. Will he succeed in regaining control of the Vatican? Nothing is less certain at a time when the Church is preparing to be called to account for the many scandals it continued to ignore during the pontificate of John Paul II. In the mid-2000s, the first scandal broke. Churchmen were alleged to have sexually abused minors. Hundreds of victims came forward in the United States.
I was raped when I was 13 in my church. He confided in you, Bishop Skolba, what he was and what he had done, and you sent him back to work. The victims won't find peace until they get justice. Until they have justice.
But worst of all, the institution itself is said to have covered up the abuse. In Ireland, at the end of 2009, a judicial commission of inquiry revealed that the Church had covered up numerous cases in the Dublin diocese.
For decades, sexual abuse of children by members of the clergy had been covered up, the perpetrators protected, and the victims ignored.
The Pope's response is eagerly awaited. He must immediately condemn the pedophile priests and summon the Irish bishops to cooperate with civil justice.
We must establish the truth about these past events, take every step to prevent them from happening again, ensure that justice is done, and above all, support the victims of these despicable crimes. And above all, to bring healing to the victims, but to all souls affected by these egregious crimes.
The Pope is fighting pedophilia. He's doing something revolutionary. He's saying that every parish, every Catholic church in the world must recognize the civil courts. There is not only God's justice, there is also civil justice. Ratzinger has American dioceses paying out over 4.5 billion euros in damages to victims of pedophilia.
For the first time in the history of the Vatican, a pope wants to break the law of silence. But that's not what public opinion will remember about him. Benedict XVI lacks the oratorical talent of John Paul II. He has therefore entrusted Vatican communications to his right-hand man, Secretary of State Bertone, a conservative who has been with the Vatican for over 30 years.
Bertone, a clever and intelligent man, has built up a great deal of power within the Vatican.
So it was he who was called upon to respond to the media on the pedophilia cases. Chile, he completely muddies the church's message.
Il va totalement brouiller le message de l'Église.
Many psychologists and psychiatrists have shown that there is no link between celibacy and pedophilia, but many others have shown, and I was recently told, that there is a link between homosexuality and pedophilia. The truth is this.
By conflating homosexuality and pedophilia, the Vatican representative is sending out a retrograde image of the Church, erasing all the efforts made by the Pope to resolve the problems internally.
Benedict XVI has been very unfortunate. There is no doubt that the person who should have collaborated most with him, the Secretary of State in the person of Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, did not live up to the Pope's expectations.
Affairs. The Secretary of State himself, Cardinal Bertone. The dossier is damning, and according to the butler, the Pope knows nothing about it.
Le pape ne sera au courant de rien.
Interviewed by the journalist, Paolo Gabriele explains why he decided to divulge the documents.
It's a gesture of anger.
Why anger?
Anger because there's an omerta. A desire not to divulge the truth, perhaps, I don't know, out of fear. Tanto per lotte di potere, forse, non lo so, per paura.
3 months later, the journalist published his investigation. The scandal broke. The press gave it a name, Vatileaks. Benedict XVI, who discovered the affair through the media, did not react. But he ordered a counter-investigation. The Vatican's only reaction was to arrest the butler. Tried before a special tribunal for document theft, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison before being pardoned by the Pope.
I find this unacceptable, surprising, sad, degrading. The only people on trial in the Vatican are those who give information to journalists. You give information, even verbally, and you risk 4 to 8 years in prison. Because in the Vatican, they do put people on trial, but they don't arrest pedophiles or those who launder mafia money. They arrest those who talk to journalists.
Cardinal Bertone will never be questioned, just like the other members of the Curia involved in this scandal. Since he can't force them, Benedict XVI will find an extreme solution. Disappear and make them disappear with him. If he resigns, whatsoever with the Italian power structure that has been in place for centuries. He is also a Jesuit, which means he advocates a church that is poor and close to the people, the exact opposite of the Roman Curia, which has been doing everything in its power for decades to preserve its privileges. But he has a major advantage in imposing himself: his immense popularity, which he has built up right from the start of his pontificate. In July 2013, the Pope made his first visit to Lampedusa, an Italian island hit hard by the migrant crisis. He came to remind the population that welcoming refugees is part of Christian values.
Europe is divided on the question of refugees, and Christian Europe is divided. That's a big problem.
Today, nobody in the world feels responsible for this. We've lost the sense of fraternal responsibility. The culture of well-being that leads us to think of ourselves makes us insensitive to the cries of others, makes us live in soap bubbles that are beautiful but are nothing, that are only the illusion of the futile, of the temporary, which leads to indifference towards others and even leads to a globalization of indifference. Del provvisorio che porta all'indifferenza verso gli altri, anzi porta alla globalizzazione dell'indifferenza.
He spoke of the globalization of indifference. He asked parishes and communities to take in the families of refugees.
The question of migrants is the social dimension of Francis' pontificate, and one that is extremely prominent. Why is this so? Because he himself comes from a world of poverty, and these migrants simply remind him of the world he comes from.
Francois is the son of Italian immigrants who left for Argentina to escape fascism in the 30s. His story resonates with that of his migrants.
Suddenly he's the darling of the world. This is a man with a genius for communication who immediately understood that his popularity would be his greatest asset.
An asset he intends to use for political ends. Pope Francis wants to remind the world that the Vatican is a state and that it has powers on the international stage.
Pope Francis wants to be a protagonist. He wants to play a role in the world, and he loves politics. In fact, he has said that a Christian should love politics.
And there is one issue on which Vatican diplomacy could have a role to play. It's the long-standing dispute between Cuba and the United States. Since the Cold War, the two countries have never managed to reconcile. But to break the deadlock, Pope Francis can count on his networks in South America.
Latin American camaraderie is a bit like John Paul II and his Polish and Baltic relatives. In this case, it's between Latin Americans.
It all began on March 27, 2014. US President Barack Obama, on an official visit to the Vatican, wasn't expecting to be taken to task by the Pope.
At that moment, the Pope tells him, "It's not the Pope talking to you, it's the Latin American. We can't stand it. We won't tolerate Cuba's continued isolation. You've got to change your policy, and we're going to help you. We're going to offer you our credibility, our ability to inspire confidence in Cuba, so that one by one we can remove all the obstacles."
And Barack Obama accepted the offer.
I would like to thank all those who have supported and helped us in this rapprochement. I especially thank His Holiness Pope Francis, who is showing us the way to make this world a better place.
5 months later, the US president made the rapprochement between the two countries official. A first diplomatic success to be attributed to Pope Francis.
It's a success not only for the Pope, but for for Vatican diplomacy as a whole, which I believe more than ever is called upon to play a major role in world affairs.
In just a few months, the new Pope has enabled the Vatican to regain its influence with the world's great and good. But Francis has another, more delicate matter to deal with. He must regain control of the Church's internal affairs, which have been confiscated for too long by the Roman Curia. To this end, he quickly set up a counterpower, a group of 9 independent cardinals, the C9.
Their job was to draw up a new constitution and to work with him as he went along to solve the various problems. So this is really to prevent the Curia from regaining power over church affairs.
I think the Pope is a man who decides. He's a decision maker.
The Roman Curia was no longer used to a Pope who makes decisions and demands transparency.
The problem is historically linked to the way the Curia runs the Vatican. The way the Roman Church has always kept the Vatican's secrets. Something Pope Francis is trying to put an end to by all means, with a very ecumenical vision of the Church.
The decision to create a restricted council of cardinals has caused much irritation among the Vatican hierarchy.
One of Pope Francis's fiercest opponents is none other than Cardinal Bertone, the Vatican's former Secretary of State, who was forced to step down when Benedict XVI stepped down. He no longer has any power, but has a lot of scores to settle. Still a member of the Curia, he has many cardinals with him who don't agree with the Pope's new policy.
He's being challenged internally, and it's clear that he's being challenged in the Roman Curia by a number of people who used to live like this, quite comfortable financially, and then quite quietly in their own little corners.
In the Vatican, a statistic is circulating. 20% of Vatican staff and Curia cardinals are in favor of the Pope. 10% are openly against the Pope, and 70% are waiting for his successor.
Et 70% attendent son successeur.
But Francis has no intention of allowing himself to be impressed by the Roman Curia. On December 22, 2014, just 1 year after his election, he prepared a tailor-made speech for them. He wants to confront them with their responsibilities in a way that no Pope has yet dared to do.
The Curia is called to improve, to keep improving, and to grow in communion, holiness, and wisdom in order to fully realize its mission. However, like any human body, it's also prone to disease. And to start with, the disease of feeling immortal, the disease of bureaucracy, the disease of disorganization, the disease of chatter, the disease of rivalry, of schizophrenia, the disease of indifference to others, of spiritual Alzheimer's, the disease of deifying leaders. It's the disease of those who court superiors, hoping to win their goodwill. They are victims of careerism and opportunism. They honor people, not God.
The Pope clearly said to us cardinals, you didn't come to Rome to be at court. He told us that the Vatican was the last court to fall. We have to get rid of a culture that no longer corresponds What was striking was that even some of his supporters were embarrassed by the severity and harshness of the speech.
Ses partisans étaient embarrassés par la sévérité et la rudesse de ce discours.
At the end of his speech, Francis comes to greet the cardinals. Everyone was smiling, including Bertone, who was directly targeted by the Pope's criticism. A facade of smiles. The members of the Curia have clearly understood who the new master of the Vatican is. But how long will he remain so? Because all his enemies are still there. In July 2016, Pope Francis arrived in Poland in the footsteps of John Paul II. He celebrates the World Youth Day. More than 3 million young Catholics came to give him a triumphant welcome. This new Pope, who wants to shake up the old church, seems to have no fear of anything.
He doesn't want to travel like a head of state. He doesn't want to travel locked up in an anti-projectile papamobile. He says he doesn't want to be in a tin can. He wants to have contact with people. Because he says, I'm old anyway. I'm almost 80. And so my life, I've already lived it. And this makes him freer in relation to the risks he faces.
He's a man who meets the people. His support is the people. St. Peter's Square is always full. His trips to Mexico, America, and everywhere else show that he is loved by the people.
Naturally, this success has its drawbacks. It comes at a price. Because Pope Francis' personal success is a success achieved by taking a stand against a church described as old, closed, rigorous, fundamentalist, hostile to the world. So, to his own advantage, he is harvesting the consensus of a large part of the world's non-Catholic secular public opinion, which is hostile to the church. Because it finds in him the person who denounces the failings of the church itself.
That said, people who call themselves Christians but don't necessarily go to church every Sunday, they're very happy to have something that lets them say they're Catholic without being laughed at. So I think this Pope Francis is very popular at the grassroots level of Catholicism, and that's his strength. How long that will last, that's a problem.
So much for this piece on the secrets of the Vatican. And we hope that this behind-the-scenes look at history has given you the keys to a better understanding of current affairs. Enjoy your evening on France 2.
In that it's a way of creating the modern image of biting the neck, which is quite often given erotic undertones, or overtones in some cases. Doing so to keep the wounds as small and clean as possible, because if one is biting the neck with regular human teeth, that gets much more messy than any sort of cinema would like to have.
It's pretty gruesome, yeah.
In fact, as well as just the fangs, pretty much any idea of a vampire being so precise and clean and civilized, I guess, is pretty much entirely a literary creation. None of the vampires of folklore that I've read about, I'm sure you might prove me wrong at some point here, Charles, but I don't think any of them really had the intellect or the civility that we see in Dracula, and that they're mostly driven by hunger.
Yeah, in my case, I will say I probably don't have anything to contradict you with, because on my end, it's mostly hairy guys all the way down.
Ah, good. I was expecting to instantly get it. No, you're wrong there. Moment. This idea of them not being particularly intelligent and mostly driven by instinct. It does also rule out the image of them sleeping in coffins or the need for them to rest in their native soil, because generally folkloric vampires didn't have the presence of mind to seek out a specific sleeping place.
Yeah, and indeed the idea of a vampire travelling that far from his resting place is very much a literary idea.
Exactly. Generally they are much more predators rather than intelligent creatures. That also automatically rules out certain magical abilities like hypnosis or turning into a bat or dissolving into mist, which are entirely from the mind of Bram Stoker. Additionally, a lot of the weaknesses that we know of are all entirely literary creations. For example, the obvious one being unable to cross a threshold without being invited, as again, requires the civility to understand what a threshold is. Though there is one creature that I'll mention later from elsewhere in the world that can't cross a threshold, but we will see that that is for entirely practical reasons. It's quite common for vampires to only be active at night, which is quite logical because these stories may have come from sightings of people or creatures that scared people and that their minds created this larger-than-life image for. But the idea of burning up in the sunlight is, again, entirely fictional. One weakness that does have a bit of a grounding in folklore is the use of garlic to ward away vampires. But in the folklore it's less specific. I mean, other strong smells could be used.
Usually it's a pungent odour is the key factor rather than actually being garlic.
Yeah, that's it. It came more from beliefs that plague was spread by miasma, and so strong smells such as garlic or spices would keep this miasma away. One weakness that, again, does have a bit of a grounding in real folklore, the idea of crosses and Christian imagery as a weakness, but that is more just because any generic encounter with something evil in Europe, people would raise their crucifix, cross themselves and recite "Lord is my shepherd" as a matter of course, really. That's not a specific to vampires thing. With that, I think that's covered all of the major things that we won't be discussing for the rest of the episode, and so I'll hand over to you, Charles.
Okay. So before we get into actual vampire folklore, as I hinted before, I thought it would be good for me to just kind of set the scene by very briefly mentioning some of the major bloodsuckers and undead of antiquity that existed in both the Middle East and Europe, who may have exerted some influence on the later folk traditions that became the vampire. So evil creatures that are known to prey on either the flesh or the blood of living humans are probably as old as humanity itself, as is the fear of the dead returning in some fashion. The earliest known accounts we have of creatures that are said to subsist at least partially on the flesh of the living include figures such as the biblical Lilith, who in some later literature is said to have been the rebellious first wife of Adam, who later went on to be characterised as something of a demonic entity that was often said to prey on children. So there is some argument that her name is actually based on an older tradition, so it has been argued that the name Lilith shares some form of origin with the Sumerian and Akkadian word Lilu, which is generally thought to mean either demon or spirit. So I came across that from when I was making my Gilgamesh video over on the Historycrat YouTube channel. I think in one version of the Sumerian Kings list, Gilgamesh's father is listed as a demon or a spirit, and he uses that term. However, in recent years there have been some challenges by scholars to the idea of this connection at all, so it may just be a coincidence of names. Going beyond these sort of figures, we also have creatures such as the Lamia of ancient Greece, who, according to the earliest accounts of Greek mythology, was said to have been a queen of Libya who had an affair with Zeus, there's that guy again, and whose children were stolen from her by Hera as a form of revenge. So in despair, the Lamia is then said to have snatched up and consumed any children she came across, and it was through these acts that she was transformed into a monster that in most representations usually has some form of serpentine aspect. The term of the Lamia also later became synonymous with figures known as the Embusai, These were shape-shifting beings that were quite similar to the later succubi, but they were mostly marked out by having the single feature of a bronze leg. In ancient Greece and Rome, we also see demonic entities such as the Strix and the Striga, which later became associated with the consumption of human flesh and blood. So in the case of the Strix, this creature was usually envisioned more as a type of bird, commonly an owl of some type, and whilst it was conceived by the ancient Greeks as some form of monstrosity, it wasn't necessarily bloodthirsty in its earliest incarnations. So according to Antonius Liberalis' Metamorphoses, not to be confused with Ovid's Metamorphoses, these Strix were created when the woman Polyphonte and her cannibal sons, who I believe had been sired by bears, were turned into owl-like creatures who never ate or drank, but cried during the night, and whose cry was an ill omen for mankind that often portended war or plague. However, by the turn of the 1st century AD, the Strix seems to have been reconceived as a bloodthirsty creature that indeed murdered children. So according to an account found in one of Ovid's other works, the Fasti, the Strigi targeted the legendary king Procas of the Etruscan city of Alba Longa in his cradle whilst he was a baby, and whilst the creatures were successfully driven off, the attack left him with lifelong scars across his cheeks. Later on, as we move through the later parts of the Roman period and into the early medieval period, the terms Lamia, Strix, and indeed the term Striga came to be used to mean both witches and evil spirits in general. So I know this term Striga in particular became associated with malevolent women who were said to be able to fly and who were engaged in cannibalism. So these words would continue to be used in this fashion into the early medieval period, although generally there seems to have been something of an opposition by the Christian Church to the idea that many of these entities existed at all. I think I mentioned this to you before, Crofty. I had a bit of a coincidence whilst I was preparing for this episode because I'm currently writing a script that involves large sections of early Christian Ireland, and in one of the early church documents from there, which is known as the First Synod of St. Patrick, belief in both the Lamia and the Striga are named as a potential reason for excommunication. The one thing I should probably point out is that the actual translation of the version I used substituted the word vampire or Striga in its texts. However, as we're going to see later, and it will become important, the word vampire didn't actually exist in the Latin language or the English language in any form, and indeed wouldn't do until the early 18th century. So moving beyond these figures, we also have examples of the restless dead that are found throughout Northern European folklore. Probably the most prominent of these are in the Icelandic sagas, such as Grettir's saga. I did look up this name, but I cannot remember how to pronounce it now. Eyjabyggiga saga. The restless dead are known as Draugr, or barrow dwellers, and largely appear both as the guardians of ancient hoards and as beings that occasionally sallied forth from tombs and attacked the living. These figures were said to be, less of a case of spirits that possessed dead bodies and more a case of the restless spirit of the dead individual that was motivated by both wealth and greed, attempting to remain as corporeal as possible. So anyone who has played the game Skyrim is probably quite aware of what the appearance of these creatures is supposed to look like, because it's quite similar to that as described in the sagas. So generally, Draugr, or wights, were characterized by their combination of superhuman strength, their appearance of being death blue or black, and also some of them were said to possess magical powers to the point where they were even immune to conventional weapons.
I'm sort of imagining the artwork that you see of Tolkien's Barrow Wights, or like the Games Workshop models of Tolkien's Barrow Wights.
Yeah.
That basically matches the description that you've just given.
Well, speaking of Tolkien, I also have a quick throwaway reference to a work which he produced a translation of in his youth, which is in the work Beowulf. The monstrous being Grendel is also similarly described as being a bloodsucker, and specifically is said to have cannibalized the bodies of the men he slays before his contention with Beowulf. So the final couple of entities I just want to mention quickly before we move on to actual vampire folklore are a couple that I hinted at earlier. So in the 15th and the 16th century works of the Malleus Maleficarum of Heinrich Kramer, and the Demonology of King James I and 6th of England, Scotland and Ireland respectively, would describe seductive demons known both as the incubi, which is the male version, and the succubi. So these figures were largely said to attempt to seduce innocents into engaging in sexual activity with them. However, there are also examples where these creatures are said to feed upon the flesh of their victims, or to in other ways cause them misfortune, such as ill health or even death. And I think there are some kind of useful parallels that can be drawn between male vampires and the traditions I'm going to talk about, and the incubi in particular. So in addition to these creatures that can kind of be seen as embodying some of the traits that folkloric vampires would go on to have, we also probably have to take into account that around the time these stories were active in Europe, blood itself played some very unusual roles in the practice of both ancient and medieval medicine. Probably the most notable practice that we should point to is, during this entire period, the pseudoscientific practice of bloodletting remained common. So this practice potentially dates back to ancient Egyptian times. The first really concrete descriptions we have of it date to the 5th century BC, when it was mentioned as a contemporary treatment by the Greek physician Hippocrates. Although, from what I read, he himself apparently relied more on rest and dietary treatments rather than such a practice. So this theory of bloodletting was based on the then existing humoral theory, which thought that the body contained 4 major humours, which were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And imbalances between these 4 different humours often were thought to result in illness. As a result, many medical treatments were based around keeping these humours in proper balance, and usually consisted of inducing practices such as vomiting, administering diuretics, or of course bloodletting to keep their respective humours at an acceptable level. So throughout the Middle Ages, this practice of bloodletting was reinforced due to the influence of the writings of the 2nd and 3rd century AD Greek physician and philosopher Galen, whose ideas on anatomy dominated for more than a millennium. I think some of them persisted as long as the 16th century AD. So Galen was a subscriber to the humoral theory of more ancient Greeks. However, he thought that in particular the blood was the most abundant of the humours, and thus was the most in need of control. And that in addition to removing it through the practice of bloodletting, it could also become stagnant in the extremities of the body and would thus require specialised methods for its removal. The result of all this was that bloodletting would remain a common treatment and would be elaborated on, with blood being taken from specific parts of the body well into the 19th century, and it did not actually die out until the early 20th century. And what's probably useful for us is that bloodletting was at its absolute peak as a medical tool in the 17th and the 18th centuries, which is when the concept of vampirism became more widely known throughout Europe. I will say what I also found kind of interesting, and this is a little off topic, was during the course of researching this, I found out that bloodletting is still used in a legitimate medical fashion. So it's mostly used for the treatment of specific blood disorders, which result in things like an accumulation of too much iron in the blood. So bloodletting is in fact still technically alive and going today.
So's leeching as well, interestingly.
Yeah.
Similar reasons.
Yeah, it turned out there was something useful there, just not in the fashion it was being used.
Yeah, it's specific reasons, not just bloodlet for everything.
So beyond this practice of bloodletting, blood was also used throughout history as a potential medical cure in itself. Specifically, in some ways, it was supposed to have rejuvenating powers. So, as far back as the Roman period, Pliny the Elder claimed that people suffering from epilepsy would drink the blood of freshly slain gladiators in the hopes that this would result in a cure. I will say that Pliny is a little bit of an unreliable source, not just in terms of, the unreliability of the cure, but also the report in itself. So maybe just take that one with a pinch of salt. In the 12th century AD, St. Hildegard of Bingen recommended baths of menstrual blood in order to cure leprosy in a similar fashion, whilst in the 15th century, the occultist Marsilio Ficino would claim that witches frequently took part in blood-sucking, writing that, quote, "It is an ancient and common opinion that certain crones, called witches, suck the blood of infants in order to rejuvenate themselves as best they can. Then why might not our elderly, finding themselves all but without hope of survival, suck the blood of a lad? Of a lad, I say, of stalwart forces, healthy, cheerful, well-tempered, excellent blood that might be by happy chance excessive. Let them such then like a leech, that is a bloodsucker, from a slightly opened vein in the skinny part of the arm, an ounce or two, then immediately take the same amount of syrup or wine. This should be done precisely when they are hungry and thirsty, and at the waxing of the moon." So to conclude this kind of section on the supposed properties attributed to blood in both ancient and medieval times, I have two notable cases where blood was used as a claimed revitalizing treatment. Now, one of these might be based on fact. The other is frequently claimed as factual, but is now thought to almost certainly be based on a conspiracy and later stories that then grew up around the incident. And indeed, this story is frequently associated with vampires, so I thought it was appropriate to include it. In the first case, it is often claimed that the 5th century Pope, Innocent VIII, was treated with blood on his deathbed after suffering a stroke. So, according to the account of Stefano Infessura, an attempt to rejuvenate the ailing Pope was made by oral administration of the collected blood of 3 separate youths, each of whom died during the process. Unfortunately for the Pope, however, these efforts were unsuccessful and he died soon after. A lot of the sources I consulted in the course of this episode basically printed this account pretty much verbatim. It should be pointed out, however, that the main source for this account was basically one of the harshest critics of this Pope, so it's entirely possible that he just completely fabricated this just to, basically kick the guy whilst he was dead. I also will point out that that particular Pope was a major opponent of witchcraft and practices during his lifetime, so it sounds unlikely, but with the state of medicine at the time, it is possible, I guess. The second case, and probably the most famous case there is of the claimed revitalizing uses of blood in history, is associated with the case of Countess Elizabeth Báthory. Elizabeth Báthory and her wider family were major landowners throughout the then Kingdom of Hungary. I think her most influential relative was King Stephen Báthory, who was king of neighbouring Poland-Lithuania and was also Prince of Transylvania. So in 1610, Elizabeth Báthory was accused by the ruling Habsburg authorities of being a major serial killer who was allegedly responsible for torturing to death up to 650 of her young female servants, a crime for which she was imprisoned in her castle until her death in 1614. And the later most famous piece of folklore that was attached to her is that she was specifically claimed to have bathed in the blood of her virgin victims in the hope that this would rejuvenate her appearance. However, it should be said again, these accounts date from well after her death, and it is now also thought by a good number of scholars that these claims and the resulting trial may have been a spectacle that was designed to destroy her and her family's power in the region. And given that this was a region that bordered on Austria, this would have been an act that very much benefited the ruling Habsburg dynasty. In particular, it's also said that the emperor of the time, which I believe was Matthias, was actually in debt to the Báthorys, so that may also include a potential motive. This account is also frequently linked to Bram Stoker's later depiction of vampires. There isn't any actual evidence of this, however. So, for example, I don't think any reference to this actually appears in his known notes. So, this may just be a later association that's kind of been made in pop culture. So, the one other thing I think that should be briefly mentioned, and I mean very briefly mentioned before we go into the actual folklore, was that in the case of murders in medieval Europe, it was often thought that blood could be used in some ways to help distinguish the potential murderer. So it was often said, for example, that a corpse would bleed in the presence of their killer, and that often this blood would be impossible to remove. I haven't gone into this in a lot of detail, but I will point out that this particular attribute does appear in the plays of Shakespeare, for example. So, getting into the actual folklore that surrounds vampires, the major accounts of vampires in Europe, or more specifically the panics that they inspired, came out of Eastern Europe from the 17th and the 18th centuries onwards, with the first major vampire craze, so to speak, occurring throughout wider Europe during the 1730s. However, it should be noted that these accounts really only present a fairly late, unified image of what constituted a vampire, and in reality there is evidence that the region has had a fairly rich body of concerns regarding the reanimation of the dead since at least the medieval period. So for an example of this, in the 14th century, the Serbian emperor Stefan Dušan would issue as part of his law code a general ban on unlawful exhumation, which read, "When it happens that by magical means people are taken out of their graves and cremated, the village where that was done must pay a fine, and the priest who came to the cremation must be deprived of his vocation." So it's from law codes such as this that you can infer that such practices of disinterring the dead who were suspected of being some form of creature may well have been endemic to the region, but that is just an inference. The exact origin of the English word vampire is itself an uncertain one. As Nick Groom notes in his work, it could originate from a number of different Slavic words. The most commonly mentioned candidates are the Russian term, I think, of upir, or possibly the Lithuanian words of vamti, which is supposed to mean to drink, or vamiti, which apparently means barking or yammering. Other words for specific vampiric entities throughout the region include the strigoi of Romanian folklore, the vampir of Serbia and Croatia, the Albanian striga, and the Polish striziga. This is only a small sampling of the various terms that are associated with vampires in this region. I mostly want to point that many of these terms that I've just mentioned there are said to be derived from the earlier Roman term of striga, but the exact route by which this transmission would have been made is not 100% certain. It is most commonly stated, however, that this transmission likely came through Greece and through the wider Balkans further into Eastern Europe. So in addition to this, we also see terms such as the Serbian term of vukodlaki, which is often used in an overlapping fashion to mean either a vampire or a werewolf. In Greece and Macedonia, there's similarly an entity known as the vrikolakas, which is commonly equated to the vampires of Eastern Europe, although it should be pointed out that in most accounts, the vrikolakas hungers more for human flesh and for livers, rather than for blood. However, both the circumstances that lead to the creation of this creature and the methods that are claimed to destroy it are almost identical to those that have been claimed for other vampiric entities, so I have decided to include it here. So that, on the whole, is just a small selection of the various terms that are used throughout these regions. I'm aware there are other terms also used in areas such as Belarus. I just wanted to give a good sampling of them here, because, again, if I went into all the local traditions and variants of vampires, I would be here for hours. For the sake of this episode, when it comes to describing the more general picture of an Eastern European or Slavic vampire, I am going to largely stick to the generalities. However, where specific instances come up and are relevant, I will try to go into those to give a bit more of a flavour of how these figures can vary. So, the picture of a vampire that is derived from most Eastern European folklore, as we described earlier, bears very little resemblance to the image of the refined, long-toothed gentleman count that we see in most media today. That's because instead of the long teeth, as Crofty said, most folkloric vampires are marked by a flushed or healthy coloured or even a dark face, the presence of fresh blood around their mouth, and a body that is swollen from their recent feeding. In addition to this, unlike their literary counterparts, in most of the reports that I found in the course of my research, the actual vampire itself is usually encountered not when it's out and mobile, but when it is resting as a corpse within its grave. So in many of the reports that describe vampires throughout these regions, when it comes to determining whether or not a particular corpse is in fact a vampire, there usually are a number of general criteria. Amongst the most important of these are that there be a presence of a freshness or a lack of decomposition or stench about the body. In addition, the continued growth of the hair or the nails, or alternatively the shedding of the nails to reveal new nails growing below, were thought to be signs of a vampire. In addition, if a corpse sheds its outer layer of skin to reveal a pale layer below, then this is also considered a potential mark of vampirism. So according to Paul Barber, there is also a Slavic tradition where a corpse found with an open mouth may be a vampire. He actually points to an example of, in all things, the novel War and Peace. There is an instance in there where the elder Prince Bolonsky actually has his mouth tied shut after he dies, and he attempted to argue in his work that this was done due to a fear of potential vampirism, but I don't know if that actually is the case or not. Another commonly reported trait of both Slavic and Germanic vampires is the presence of a white liver within the corpse, which is usually thought to be due to a deficiency of bile. And finally, probably the most important trait of all is the presence of either liquid blood within the corpse or within the grave or on the grave clothes. So after a person died and became a vampire, the newborn creature was often said to consume its own grave clothes and shroud, and sometimes to even tear at its own flesh and to rip out its bowels. After remaining in its coffin for a period, the vampire would then leave its grave in search of victims. Often it was said that it would start with its own kin. A male vampire in particular would often seek to have sex with his wife, with any offspring that were conceived as a result being largely marked by having no skeleton. In most of these accounts, the vampire is usually male, however there are a few female ones that do pop up. As you mentioned before, Crofty, where the modern image of a vampire has a vampire being unable to enter a particular residence until it's invited inside, that is not found in the Slavic tradition of a vampire in the slightest. In fact, in these traditions, a vampire was capable of entering the home through any gap, no matter how small, and once it did so, it would not in fact attempt to kill its victims by draining their blood directly, and often would not even kill using its teeth. Instead, most would instead suffocate their victim. So this would be done either by actively strangling them, or in areas such as Bulgaria, this was done by the vampire sitting on their chest until they expired. And often only then would the vampire proceed to drain the victim's blood. Amongst the vampires that did bite their victims, the area of biting often tended to vary. Sometimes victims would be bitten over the left breast, over the heart or the nipple, and sometimes even between their eyes. So in addition to these disruptive activities, vampires were also often considered to be general harbingers of ill omen for a community. Often they were thought to act as vectors for illnesses such as the plague. What we should probably also note is that throughout much of European history, and during the time of these reports first came out of Eastern Europe, the idea that an illness could circulate independently of any physical force wasn't really a concept. So as you mentioned before, Crofty, the idea of there being a miasma, for example, that would spread illness or a form of bad air was ascribed to. And the idea that illness could just circulate independent of some sort of force or some form of divine retribution didn't really develop until towards the end of the 18th century. So as a result, it's somewhat unsurprising that a vampire would be considered a suitable agent to explain the spread of an otherwise invisible contagion. So the folklorist Claude Lécuchet, who I believe we mentioned in the Wild Hunt episode, has also attempted to argue that the emergence of vampire outbreaks in the wider European consciousness came right as the European witch hunts were dying down, and as such, their popularity from the 18th century onwards may have been because they provided a convenient replacement to explain the outbreak of the plague. An ironic note to add to all this is that vampire blood itself was actually occasionally considered to have restorative properties, despite the problems associated with vampires themselves, and often it was specifically said that it could be used to cure someone who themselves had contracted vampirism, which I will mention in the form of an example later. So the exact ways in which a vampire could be created differed throughout Eastern Europe. Common reasons that were given for a person being susceptible to becoming a vampire include that they were murdered, that they drowned, they committed suicide, that they were the victim of a plague, that they suffered some form of curse in life, or were placed under some form of restriction by a priest, or that they were not accorded the proper burial rites. Often authors tend to group a lot of these reasons under the category of the vampire being someone who has some form of unfinished business in life. Alternatively, people could be born with certain traits that supposedly marked them out as being likely to become a vampire after their death. So, for example, amongst the Polish and the Kashubs of northern Germany, it was said that anyone who was born with, quote, a red cowl over their head, which is usually thought to mean the amniotic membrane, or who is born with 2 teeth, is thought to become a vampire. The other common traits in areas such as Romania and Russia include people who are born with a split lip, an extra nipple, a hairy chest or back, or who are born with a tail-like extension to the spine. In particular, the figure of a Stryziga in Poland could also be marked out by being born with, quote, 2 hearts and 2 sets of teeth. In addition to these predispositions towards becoming a vampire, it was also commonly believed throughout much of Slavic folklore that a corpse could become a vampire if either a person or an animal of some type jumped or flew across it, which I believe, Crofty, we might possibly come across that concept again when you're discussing the idea of vampire-like entities in China.
Yeah, that one does briefly come up, yes.
And then finally, of course, those people who were killed by a vampire were generally thought to also become vampires, along with those who also ate the meat of an animal that was killed by a vampire. So if those are the activities and the potential causes of vampires, how might one go about ridding themselves of such a creature? Well, as with the causes, the exact methods used tend to vary somewhat throughout the regions in which vampire folklore is known. However, the most consistent methods of destroying a vampire were thought to be through either staking the creature, through the heart, or in the case of vampires found with their mouths open, through the mouth, or through decapitating the body. So, the type of wood that would be used for these stakes tended to vary between regions. So, in Serbia, hawthorn was generally used, whilst in places like Russia and the Baltic states, ash was the preferred wood, as I think it was in northern Germany as well. After this, in some cases, the body would simply be reinterred, or if it was judged to be necessary, it would be destroyed through cremation. Or in some cases, I think it's even mentioned that it was disposed of by being thrown into a nearby body of water, such as a river. Sometimes the decapitated head would also be reinterred with the body, or would be reinterred separately so that the two could not combine again. Other methods also included driving nails into the body, particularly the forehead, or for the creature's heart to be removed and destroyed. Sometimes, however, all that was really required was for a vampire's body to be reinterred with proper funeral rites being performed. Other methods involve trying to prevent a freshly buried corpse from becoming a vampire, so a common way of doing this was to place the body in the coffin upside down, which was thought to prevent the vampire from finding its way back up to the surface, or to place some object within the grave that would either remove the vampire's need to come back to life, or that would simply prevent it from coming back at all. A good example of this is how an item, such as a pot shard or a rock, might be placed inside the suspected vampire's mouth. This is usually done so that the creature would chew upon this, rather than chewing upon its shroud or its flesh, or attempting to seek out its kin in order to chew upon them. Alternatively, a brick might be placed under the corpse's chin in order to prevent it from chewing at all, which is similar to the practice of binding to the mouth that we mentioned before. Other practices included placing sharp objects, such as a sickle, in the grave, so that the corpse was prevented from swelling and thus becoming a vampire. In some regions, the sickle was instead said to be placed across the neck, so the creature would decapitate itself should it try to rise, or it was instead used to pierce the corpse's heart. I did see, when I was researching this, I did also kind of see a theory that this may be where some of the later imagery of the Grim Reaper may have come from, but that was just a throwaway thing I saw. I had not had the chance to verify it, so it could be complete nonsense. But it could be a small kernel of truth there. Often nets and stockings would also be buried with a suspected vampire in order to occupy the creature, and the rationale that it would become obsessed with untying the knots. There were some regions, however, where this generally wasn't done, so this wasn't really done amongst the Kashubs, and it also was not done amongst the Greeks, as they felt that this would prevent the corpse from decomposing properly. So the final category I have here of these sort of methods is methods and items that were designed to ward off vampires. So probably the most common method I found that was used to thwart these creatures was to sprinkle sand, seeds, or other particulate matter either in the grave of the suspected vampire itself or on the path that led to the grave. So this was done because it was thought that the vampire would be forced to count each and every one of these items, and in some accounts this only took place at the rate of 1 a year. So that was thought to be a particularly effective protection.
Wait, the vampire was forced to count things?
Yes, because it was obsessed with them, and it only would count them often at the rate of 1 a year.
Sesame Street had truth to it. 1, ha ha ha. 2. I'm very sorry.
No, it's fine. So a similar practice also involved people sprinkling poppy seeds in each corner of their house, which again was thought to provide a measure of protection against a vampire entering the residence. This was supposedly done due to, of all things, the poppy seed's narcotic effect on the vampire, which would encourage it to sleep. If you know anything about what poppies can be used to make, that sort of makes sense, but the actual amount of narcotic that could possibly be present in a single seed is probably not a lot.
You're going to need most of a field.
In addition to this, we also have vampires being warded off by strong smells, as you noted with your comparison to garlic in our criteria at the beginning. One thing that, interestingly, doesn't really come into folklore surrounding vampires in this region is the effects that mirrors might have on vampires. So in some later versions, vampires are said to have an aversion to mirrors, if only because it can give away that they have no shadow. That does not seem to have been the case in vampire folklore, although in some regions such as Bulgaria, it was thought that exposing a body to a mirror was an ill omen, because by projecting effectively 2 bodies, you were inviting a further death. Now that we've gone through kind of the generic attributes of a folkloric vampire, let's move on to discuss some more specific examples of supposed vampire outbreaks. Now, these were largely reported at the very end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, and there's a possible reason why that I will get into shortly. So amongst the earliest accounts, we have that of a man by the name of Gier Grando, which occurred in 1672. So Grando was a man from Croatian Istria who was said to have risen from the dead as what is described as a lišnam, or a restless corpse, 16 years after his death. So after returning home, he went on to sexually assault his wife and visited his neighbours by knocking on their doors at night, and anyone who was said to have heard that knock, that household was said to be destined to have a death. So after multiple attempts to get rid of him failed, which included an attempted exorcism by the local priest and multiple attempts to stake him with a hawthorn stick. But I think one encounter it's described where the hawthorn stick was thrown at him as he was encountered on the streets and it just bounced off his chest. Eventually, his body was exhumed and found to be undecayed, and after another attempt to stake him, he was eventually decapitated, at which point peace returned to the region. A very detailed early 18th century report of such a creature is also given in the work of the botanist Joseph Piton de Tournefort, who described an incident with a Greek Vricolakas on the island of Mykonos. So this incident, which supposedly dated back to 1701, concerned an unnamed peasant who rose from the dead. In Tournefort's account, we are told that this peasant, who was said to have been a quarrelsome man in life, died by the hands of unknown assailants out in the fields near the town and was buried in the chapel shortly after. 2 days later, it was made known that the same peasant had been seen out walking during the night and indeed had come into the homes of the inhabitants, where he engaged in such antics as turning over the furniture, extinguishing the lamps, and embracing people from behind. So at first the inhabitants were inclined to mostly see this as just harmless fun, which is very strange, but later some of the more respectable citizens of the town began to complain, and so after a number of meetings, the local town leaders and priests decided to intervene on the 10th day since the corpse was buried. So after saying a mass within the chapel in which the man was interred, the residents had the body disinterred, upon which his heart was cut out and destroyed. I believe Tournefort was actually present for this event, and he claims that due to the great stink that arose from the corpse, incense was burnt within the chapel. However, later some of those present would claim that the resulting smoke came from the corpse itself as it was dissected. Tournefort would note that later residents would also swear that the body was still warm and its blood fresh. However, he and his party claimed to have been situated near the corpse, and according to him, quote, the body was quite adequately dead. If you can't tell, he was very skeptical about the idea that this was a vampire of some sort. So at this point, a crowd arrived who claimed they had been present when the body was transported for burial, and that it did not become stiff upon death, which is another trait attributable to vampires, and as such, it was definitely a true Vricolakas. So despite this action, the creature apparently remained active and grew only more violent. People claim that he would attack people at night, destroy their property, tear up their clothing, and if he found any liquids that had been left out, he would consume them. So eventually people became so terrorised that many families would leave their homes at night and bed down on pallets in the town square instead. After this, the villagers disinterred the body multiple times, so they ended up filling its mouth with holy water. They planted several swords within the grave until they realised the swords made a crude cross that were preventing the spirit or demon within the creature from escaping. Finally, they eventually brought matters to a head by burning the body on a pyre, upon which points the reports of the creature ceased. So Tournefort basically attributed the whole incident not to any supernatural being, but claims it was an attack of mass hysteria and irrationality by the villagers, and condemns the disinterment as being unlawful. It is also in the early 1720s that we get the first literary account laying out the typical traits of a folkloric vampire as part of a study of the natural history of Poland, written by the Jesuit priest Father Gabriel Razasinski, himself drawing upon the work of a Father Gengel. In this work, we see the first known account of a Russian Upir, which appears to have been drawn from Gengel's accounting of local superstitions, and reads as follows. I have frequently heard from credible eyewitnesses that human bodies have been found not only incorrupt, flexible, and ruddy for a long time, but moreover the head, the mouth, the tongue, and the eyes are sometimes seen to move. The winding sheet in which they are wrapped is undone and parts of the body are devoured. At times it is also noted that a body of this kind rises again from the grave, wanders past crossroads and houses showing himself now to one, now to another, and also attacks many, trying to suffocate them. If it is a male body, it is called a Upir. If it is a female, it is called a Upierzicha, as if to say a feathered one, i.e. a body provided with down or feathers, light and agile for movement. The actual widespread popularization of accounts of vampires throughout Europe can be traced to two events that occurred in extension to these in the early 18th century. These took place in the Balkans, much like the events of the early 19th century had a big effect on Europe. For historical context, this initial popularization of vampire attacks came place immediately after the end of the Austro-Turkish War of 1716 to 1718, which ended in the Treaty of Passarowitz. Under the terms of this treaty, the Austrian Habsburg Empire managed to temporarily extend their territory into northern Syria, along with Bosnia and Wallachia, and it is during this period of military occupation by the Austrians that we get the first really heavily documented accounts of vampiric attacks that were recorded by the official authorities. Two accounts that received the most publicity were related to two Serbian men whose respective deaths were said to have unleashed vampiric attacks throughout their local communities. So the first of these men was Peter Blagojevic, also known as Peter Plogojevic, who was a local of the village of Kisilova, who died in 1725 and whose case was investigated by the imperial provisor from Bald. So here is the direct report of his case. It's not too long, so I'm going to give a direct translation of the full report, which reads, after a subject by the name of Peter Plogojevic had died 10 weeks past, he lived in the village of Kisilova in the Ram district and had been buried according to the Reitzian custom. It was revealed that in this same village, within a week, 9 people, both old and young, died also after suffering a 24-hour illness. And they said publicly, while they were yet alive but on their deathbed, the above-mentioned Plogojevic, who had died 10 weeks earlier, had come to them in their sleep, laid himself on them, and throttled them, so that they would have to give up the ghost. The other subjects were very distressed and strengthened, even more so in such beliefs, by the fact that the dead Peter Plogojevic's wife, after saying that her husband had come to her and demanded his opanki, or shoes, had left the village of Kisilova and gone to another. And since with such people, which they call vampires, various signs are to be seen, that is, the body undecomposed, the skin, hair, beard and nails growing, the subjects resolved unanimously to open his grave and see if the above-mentioned signs were really to be found on him. To this end they came here to me, and telling of these events, asked me and the local pope, or parish priest, to be present at the viewing. And although I at first disapproved, telling them that the praiseworthy administration would first be dutifully and humbly informed, and its exalted opinion about this should be heard, they did not want to accommodate themselves to this at all, but rather gave this short answer: I could do what I wanted, if I did not accord them the viewing and the legal recognition to deal with the body, according to their custom, they would have to leave house and home, because by the time a gracious resolution was received from Belgrade, perhaps the entire village, and this was already supposed to have happened in Turkish times, would be destroyed by such an evil spirit, and they did not want to wait for this. Since I could not hold such people from the resolution they had made, either with good words or with threats, I went to the village of Kisilova, taking with them the Gradish Pope, and viewed the body of Peter Plogojevic, just exhumed, finding in accordance through truthfulness that first of all I did not detect the slightest odour that is otherwise characteristic of the dead, and of the body except for the nose, which was somewhat fallen away, was completely fresh. The hair and the beard, even the nails, of which the old ones had fallen away, had grown on him. The old skin, which was somewhat whitish, had peeled away, and a new fresh one had emerged under it. The face, the hands and the feet, and the whole body were so constituted that they could not have been more than complete in his lifetime. Not without astonishment, I saw some fresh blood in his mouth, which according to the common observation he had sucked from the people killed by him. In short, all the indications were present that such people, as remarked above, are said to have. After above, the Pope and I had seen this spectacle, while the people grew more outraged and distressed. All of the subject with great speed sharpened a stake in order to pierce the corpse of the deceased within it, and put this at his heart, whereupon he was pierced. Not only did more blood completely fresh flow also through his ears and mouth, but such other wild signs, which I passed by out of high respect, took place. Finally, according to their usual practice, they burned the oft-mentioned body to ashes, of which I inform the most laudable administration, and to the same time would like to request obediently and humbly that if a mistake was made in this matter, such as to be attributed not to me, but by the rabble who were beside themselves with fear. So here we can see a fairly characteristic case of a vampire being presented as the start of an epidemic, though as Paul Barber noted in his work, the actual vampirism exhibited basically boils down to we found a corpse that hadn't decayed as much as we thought it should have. So the second major case occurred in the aftermath of all this, but this was only the date of reporting. So the actual investigation in this case didn't take place until several years after the fact. So it took place in the village of Medvedja and concerned a man by the name of Arnold Paul. So Paul was a former Serbian soldier or Hajduk who had returned and settled in his native village, where he died in 1727 after the hay wagon he was driving on overturned and he broke his neck. Some 20 to 30 days after his death, however, it was reported that he rose from his grave and killed 4 people. Now, where Paul's case differs from the previous one is that we actually have some details of his claimed behaviour prior to his death. So specifically, he is said to have been plagued by a vampire himself, and indeed that he went to great lengths in order to rid himself of this. So it was said that this included consuming dirt from the grave of the vampire, and when this did not work, he attempted to cure himself by smearing himself with its blood. After the deaths, his body was exhumed on the 40th day since it was buried, and found to be undecayed. So according to the later report written by the authorities, fresh blood also flowed from his eyes, nose, mouth, ears, and more blood covered his grave clothes, his shroud and his coffin, and his nails and skin had fallen off to expose new ones in their place. Judging him on this appearance to be a vampire, those present drove a stake through his heart, at which point he gave out an audible groan and blood poured from within him. After these, those present burned his body and scattered its ashes in the graves, then proceeded to do the same for each of his victims, to be sure. However, what's significant about this case is that this did not prevent a second wave of vampire attacks from breaking out some years later, in 1731, and it is in fact this wave of attacks that led to the actual official investigation, which was carried out by a medical team sent by the Austrian authorities. So according to their report, which was compiled by Officer Johann Flukinger, it was claimed that in addition to feeding on humans, Arnold Paul had also fed on animals, and that in time more vampires arose due to people consuming these creatures' flesh. The result is that over the course of several months, a total of 17 people, young and old, passed away, some of whom had shown no prior sign of illness, but instead expired rapidly over only 2 or 3 days. So amongst these was a girl named Joviza, who was said to have laid down to sleep fresh and healthy, only to start to wake suddenly at midnight with a terrible cry, and complain that she had been throttled by the son of a local soldier named Milo, who had himself died 9 weeks earlier. After this, she began to experience a great pain in her chest, and gradually grew weaker until she died 3 days later. In response to this death and others, the medical team proceeded to open several of the graves of suspected vampires to examine the conditions. Their report notes that some of these bodies were then dissected, with Flukinger apparently conducting at least one dissection himself of a woman named Stana, who had died during childbirth. According to his report, before death this woman had attempted to protect herself by again smearing her body with the blood of a known vampire, but despite this her body was found to be undecayed, with a large quantity of liquid blood still within her pectoral cavity. In addition, her body also carried many of the other hallmarks of a vampire, e.g. the shedding of the nails and skin, and in another instance an older woman by the name of Melisa was said to have been found plump and fresh within her grave, despite having been known to be very lean during life. Obviously, all of these were taken as signs of vampirism. So after the exhumations were concluded, the bodies that were judged to be vampires had their heads cut off by what the report describes as the local gypsies, as in the Romani, which is one of the kind of first threads we kind of see of the Romani people being kind of associated with later vampire lore, and the bodies were burned, with the ashes being thrown into the river Morava. So as with the earlier case, this account obviously carries many of the hallmarks of your typical vampire scare. However, if we put aside, again, the hearsay regarding the death of Arnold Paul, which was not observed by the medical team, what we actually have is a case of a number of people dying suddenly within a community in 2 separate outbreaks, and a number of bodies, again, simply being found not to have decayed to the level that they would have been expected to. There may be a potential explanation for this, as I will go into later. So, these 2 accounts quickly became famous throughout Europe. In particular, the Arnold Paul case was published in the Glenier Historique, which was a French-language journal published in the Netherlands. This journal basically made its name on publishing articles on vampirism in the course of 1732, and its work ended up being republished in a wide number of journals throughout Austria and Germany, then later being translated and published in English and French. The Peter Plogojovic's case similarly was published in a Viennese paper called Wienerreich Diarim in July 1725, and similarly was translated and circulated widely throughout Northern and Western Europe. 1732 also saw a large number of scholarly works being published on the topic of vampirism, which continued in succeeding years. In Britain, the Paul case was reported in the London Journal on March 11, 1732, as, quote, a horror story from Heiducken, which I think is a misconception of the term for soldier in the area. Heiducken in Hungary, namely of dead bodies sucking, as it were, the blood of the living, for the latter visibly dry up, whilst the former are filled with blood. So this and other stories would contribute to something of a vampire mania in parts of the British upper class, and it was said that this was believed by figures such as King George II, who himself was of German origin, and the Elector of the State of Hanover. It is also around this time that the word vampire seems to have entered the English language. It would go on in decades to be used in a political sense, and also used often in conjunction with religion. So throughout the remainder of the 18th century, similar claimed outbreaks of vampirism were reported. So, for example, in Croatia in 1737, the island of Lastovo was struck by a severe case of dysentery that was blamed on a vampire, and that would result in a number of corpses being exhumed and decapitated. In the years 1754 to 56, vampire outbreaks were also reported throughout the regions of Wallachia, the Banat, and Moravia, including the case of a woman named Rosina Polakin from the village of Hermersdorf. So upon being exhumed, her body was found to still have liquid blood within its veins, which resulted in her family members dragging it by a hook through a hole in the local churchyard wall, after which they decapitated it and burned the remains. So in 1749, as part of increasing church backlash to these reports, Pope Benedict XIV declared vampires to be, quote, fallacious fictions of human fantasy, and his work on the beatifaction of the servants of God and on the canonization of the beatified. And by the mid-1750s, direct action to address these exhumations could no longer really be avoided. So in 1755, the Empress Maria Theresa, herself a devout Catholic, dispatched 2 doctors, Johannes Gasser and Christian Fabst, to investigate the outbreaks and report to her personal physician and head surgeon of the military, Gerard van Swieten. Luckily, van Swieten was a frank rationalist, and he would go on to write a treatise on vampires where he basically attributed it all to superstition and mass hysteria. So So, based on the reports he received, he recommended that it be decreed that those suspected of vampirism and other crimes should not be executed, and that books on witchcraft and demonology be banned. The result was that on March 1st, 1755, the Empress decreed that vampires were figments of the imagination and that no evidence of supernatural activity had been found. The staking and burning of corpses was banned, and cases involving vampirism were removed from the jurisdiction of the regional court and of the religious courts, and after resulting further decrees, the appellate courts also began to throw out vampirism cases as unsubstantiated. Around the same time, many traditional witch hunting practices were also effectively banned, meaning that both vampirism and witchcraft were effectively made visible in the official eyes of the government. So over the rest of the 18th century, the wave of enthusiasm for accounts of vampire outbreaks in Europe would gradually die down. So one factor in this was that after this initial wave of enthusiasm dissipated, doctors and scholars largely started to become more skeptical of the idea of vampirism. So after the initial wave of popularity, there was something of an effort by various scholars to medicalize vampirism, and a number of possible different definitions and lists of symptoms were bandied about. However, over time, after no clear set of symptoms were agreed upon, reports of vampirisms increasingly became seen in light of good old-fashioned Western European prejudices against Eastern Europe. So for centuries by that point, Eastern Europe had been characterized as a superstitious and credulous place by people in Western Europe. A lot of this seems to be based on the fact that the Orthodox Church was prevalent throughout much of the region. And basically between these attitudes and various governments of Eastern Europe putting measures in place to prevent the bodies of claimed vampires being defiled, this led to a slow drop in interest in these cases until they largely died out. And as a kind of closing point of my section, in 1764, the writer Voltaire would even lampoon the idea of vampires in his philosophical dictionary, which came as part of a much longer attack on the concept. So the little quote I have here is, "If there is in this world a well-attested account, it is that of the vampires. Nothing in lacking, official reports, affidavits of well-known people, of surgeons, of priests, of magistrates, the judicial proof is most complete. And with all that, who is there who believes in vampires?" The end result of all of this was that the first popular wave of interest in vampire folklore largely died out in Europe by the end of the 18th century, and it would take the later literary reinvention of the vampire in the 19th century by authors such as John William Polidori with his short story The Vampire, and of course the works of Bram Stoker to revive it. So inevitably, one question that you ask yourself whilst you're reading about these sort of vampire outbreaks and folklore is, are there some possible explanations for these supposed incidents that go beyond simple superstition and figments of the imagination of the people reporting them? Well, there have been various attempts by scholars and even medical professionals to explain the events that may lead to potential vampire outbreaks. In particular, a lot of scholars have pointed to the poor understanding of the processes of decomposition as they were known in Europe during the time, and in particular how these processes can vary in speed. So obviously the rate at which a body decomposes can vary quite widely depending on the time of year that they were buried, or the conditions of the burial soil itself, if the individual was buried in a coffin or if they were buried simply in a shroud. The easiest example to point to is if someone is buried in the cooler part of the year, their body is likely to stay fresher for longer just because of the colder conditions. For example, I should point out the bodies that were exhumed during the Arnold Paul case were actually exhumed in winter. So there's a pretty good explanation as to why some of the bodies may have been in better condition. In addition to this, a couple of explanations that are a bit more conjecture have been pointed out. So it has been claimed that bodies that are buried in hot conditions in materials such as clay, sand, mud or silt can undergo a process where their soft tissues are effectively converted to what is known as adipocere, or cemetery grease, in low oxygen conditions. So normally this is a process that can take months or even years to occur, but there are a few instances known of it happening quite rapidly, and what it basically results in is the body is effectively turned into a cast of itself that makes it appear whole. So that's a slightly more outlandish possibility for why some bodies may have been perceived in this manner. It does not explain things like the fresh expulsion and appearance of blood, however. In addition, decomposing bodies are well known to swell with gases, and the releases of these gases may explain the groans that some reports noted that individuals made when they were staked, or just generally reports of vampires groaning or moaning or gibbering within their graves that are sometimes found within Eastern folklore. In addition, people have tried to link the actual physical characteristics claimed by sightings of vampires when they're out and about at their graves to people who are suffering from specific illnesses. So, as mentioned before, vampires in folklore were often associated with the spread of the plague, and there may be a little bit more basis in fact than you would think to this. So as Paul Barber notes in his book, one of the symptoms of the pneumonic form of the plague is that the victim coughs up large amounts of blood in their saliva, and this may explain the appearance of supposedly fresh bloods on the mouths of either disinterred plague victims or people who are in the final throes of the plague who may be mistaken for vampires. In addition to this, there's been some slightly more fringe theories. One of them is that since the late 1990s, there's a Spanish neurologist by the name of Dr. Juan Gomez Alfonso, who has attempted to link the historical descriptions of vampire encounters with people suffering from the advanced stages of rabies. So, I don't know how familiar you are with rabies, Crofty, but in its final stages, its symptoms can include such things as delirium, paranoia, terror, the presence of hallucinations, a fear of water, partial paralysis, agitation, aggressive behaviour, which in some cases can include biting, and eventually collapse into coma and death. In addition to this, there's other claimed diseases that may explain some of these conditions. So, for example, one claimed condition is that of cutaneous porphyria, which most people would probably know of as a much more debilitating variant on the condition that King George III of the United Kingdom is supposedly had that explained his madness. However, it should be noted that many of the claims that have been made around the symptoms of this condition are inaccurate. So a commonly repeated one is that people suffering from cutaneous porphyria have a compulsion to consume blood. This is thought to be completely false. And the kind of final fringe theory I have is that individuals who were mistaken for vampires, it has been claimed, could be suffering from vitamin B3 deficiency, which results in a condition known as pellagra, due to it resulting in their skin becoming basically intolerant to sunlight. However, it should be pointed out that intolerance to sunlight is not a trait associated with folkloric vampires, so this seems unlikely. So some of those accounts that I mentioned before literally include vampires being active between noon and sundown. As a whole, it's not really thought that one of these illnesses in particular can fully explain these outbreaks. So it's thought that in addition to a combination of possible factors like these, there's other more mundane explanations. So one possibility, for example, is people who are impoverished, who have resorted to taking refuge in crypts as living quarters, being mistaken for vampires. Other possibilities include people who were accidentally buried alive, who managed to claw their way out of their grave, and were found in a weakened condition. And the old faithful of all accounts of ghosts and demons and people suffering from poltergeists and stuff like that has also been applied to vampires, and that is people suffering from sleep paralysis. So I, during a period in my 20s, did suffer from sleep paralysis occasionally, where I basically had the classic version where I would seemingly wake up and I would be in my room, and I would have difficulty breathing, and I'd be aware of my surroundings, but I would not be able to move in any meaningful way. I'd be able to slump my body upwards slightly, but that was it, basically. Some people report the feeling of a presence or even visual hallucinations during the course of sleep paralysis. So I can 100% see that being attributed to something like people waking up and claiming they were suffocated by some entity.
Yeah, that crops up with quite a few other creatures and pieces of folklore as well, so it makes sense.
Yeah. And of course, one other reason maybe good old-fashioned hysteria and superstition.
Always a fun one.
Okay, Crofty, so after my incredibly long-winded account there of Slavic traditions of the vampires and how those spread further across Europe, let's now have a bit of a look further afield.
Thank you, Charles. I'd use the word thorough because, we want to be talking positively about our own podcast.
Yes.
And also because as thorough as I've tried to be for this next section, it's a lot of small scattered references and things where there is very little information on. And I really hope there are historians and folklorists out there finding more on this stuff so that in 10 years' time I can read more on it. So, before I go into my whistle-stop tour around the world, I am going to reiterate the point that we made at the start, in that a lot of these accounts are very heavily influenced by European colonialism. I've tried to, where possible, find original accounts or translations of original accounts and original mentions, but these are unfortunately quite rare. There will be creatures that have been described by modern writers as vampires that I've missed out. I've basically gone for the ones that I could find mentioned in as many modern sources as I could, and then gone back into the folklore as best I can. And I will often be pointing out that these things don't meet both of our criteria that we mentioned at the start. So with all of those disclaimers, I'm going to start with vampiric creatures in Africa. And I will say that all vampires in Africa were wiped out in 1982 when Toto blessed the rains down in Africa.
What a sad, sad day for vampire kind.
If that joke gets me fired for being terrible, worth it. Sorry, serious face.
Serious vampire face, yeah.
So, in Africa, the main creatures that I've been able to find that have been described as having vampiric traits are clustered around Western Africa, particularly from the folklore of the Ashanti tribe in the region around what's now Ghana. One of these creatures, which European writers have described as a blood-drinking witch, is known as the Obayifo by the people of Ghana, and also by the name the Asiman. These witches were humans who were living in the community, who had gained the ability to leave their body and travel at night as a glowing light, and in this form they would attack children and drink their blood. Usually this would be done quite gradually so as not to be noticeable, and according to some sources this was done in a way that the victim felt pain but never showed any physical mark of the attack. Some of these witches were also said to suck out the heart. Scholars have attributed these abilities to explanations for slow-acting poisons or to diseases such as tuberculosis. These witches were also thought to be able to preserve their bodies in death and inhabit their dead body. So, it does actually meet both of our criteria.
Yeah, it technically counts. Yeah. Technically correct, the best type of correct.
Yep, and I realised I went through all that disclaimer and then the first one does actually meet the criteria.
Yeah.
I'm off to a great start. As well as this, these witches could raise the dead as their servants or familiars through disinterring the body, cutting out the tongue, and driving a peg into its brain. And it would bind these creatures to them as a ghoul-like creature that was known as an Isthvantala or an Impundulu, which was also thought to either drink blood or eat the flesh of dead humans. The Ashanti tribes do also have legends of a more monstrous creature that has been described as a vampire, which is known as either the Asanbosam or the Sasabonsam. The first descriptions in English of these